So this morning I was intending to speak about the dream exploration again, and we didn't get around to doing that, but we covered some other very useful topics. So we'll see if we explore the dream perspective again. Now, the reason that I'd like to talk about that again is sometimes we hear about something that we have no frame of reference for. So we hear an explanation about something, and if bits and pieces are missing, it is not going to just really click. And so it isn't necessarily an easy thing to grasp. And if we don't grasp what it really means, that this could be a dream, or let's come to see it let's explore it as if it is a dream. And so that means we need a very good understanding of what that means. In order to actually find ourselves viewing life with a tangible sense, a tangible revelation that it's a dream. And once that revelation happens, and we can see life from this perspective where, in a sense, everything that happens is seen as an imagination in mind, a creation, a virtual reality, an imagination that manifests as time and space and all of the objects and all of the movement of the objects. Once that happens, and if it happens as a peak experience or as a perspective shift, it will be different to how we tend to know the experience of life. But then we'll come to a place where we have to say, well, actually, even with this shift, I don't know that it's a dream. But the shift will allow us to know life from a perspective that we can see it could be a dream. Right? It's a nuance. But at first we have to relate to it in the way that we relate to it and start seeing it as if it is a dream. So let's look at the night dream. And how a night dream is experienced from the perspective of the night dream character. How it's experienced and how real the dream world appears from within the dream. Because if we can understand the dream and how everything within the dream relates to each other, and how the dream relates to the mind in which it arises, and how the mind in which it arises essentially is consciousness, and how the content that is within that consciousness is actually not separate from the consciousness, and how it is content but it's not what it appears to be. From within the dream it appears to be solid, furniture and ground and sand and sea and body, and as we're exploring this, so we know from within the dream it's all very real, but as we explore it from sort of looking at a dream from our perspective, we can understand that what seems very real is actually not real in the way it appears from within the dream. When we look at a dream when we're awake and we think about our night dreams, I hope I haven't confused everyone completely. So we're really going to understand night dreams well. If we understand night dreams well relative to the dreamer, we can then, I will suggest that this is a mirror, or the night dream is a mirror-down version of this life relative to the dreamer that we don't know. We don't know the dreamer that is dreaming this dream. We are actually the content of the dream. And from within the dream, as we've been discussing, everything seems and appears to be a particular way. And from outside the dream, we know, or looking at a dream from outside, which we can't really do, you don't see the dream, but you can analyze a dream from outside, then we realize that what seems very real from inside the dream is not what it appears to be from inside the dream. So we understand the night dream. The night dream is a mirror-down version of what our experience of life is, if in fact the experience of life is a dream, and it would mean that there is a dreamer, God, essentially, the God of this world, just like the person lying in the bed having a night dream is essentially the God of the dream world. If what we know as daily life is a dream, and there is a God dreaming our daily life, then when we go to sleep and have a night dream, we're not really the God of that night dream, because the God that creates what we know as daily life is also creating the dream within the dream. So let's assume, for starters, that the daily life that we know is not a dream. We'll assume the daily life that we know is an objective reality, meaning that the planets really do exist as planets, and they grew from all the stuff that science tells us they grew from, gases and various elements under high pressure, etc., etc. And that everything in this objective world, in the universe, is real and is not some imagination in God. We'll assume that for now. So the people that go to bed at night are real objective people. And they have their own consciousness. A consciousness, let's assume, for the sake of this exploration, a consciousness that is part of the neurology of the human being, that is part of this objective world. So the human being also was formed as part of the evolution of the universe, and they are objectively real. And so the development of the brain and the heart and the full development of humans as we are now has happened, and consciousness is part of that development, that evolution. So we are conscious human beings who at night get tired, go to sleep, and as we know from our experience, dreams arise in the human being's consciousness. So when the human, let's go back a step and talk about the different forms of consciousness or states of consciousness. So you have the human being that is a conscious human being, and during the day, there is a state of consciousness that we call the waking state, where we are aware of the world, which we're saying is an objective reality, and we're aware of that objective reality, and that awareness is what we can call the waking state. When the human being gets tired at night, goes to sleep, what replaces so in the waking state, hopefully we can understand that the human body has senses, and the light, for example, reflects off the objects in the world, off the objective, the real objects. Light reflects off those, the eyes pick up the various reflections, and then they send the data to the brain. In fact, what's interesting to know is that the eyes pick up the light and then form an image that is actually upside down, sort of like in one of the old cameras. The light goes into the camera and then the image is in its negative form. So it's not really upside down, it's an inverse image. So this is very helpful if we're wanting to understand what the waking state is. So everything you're seeing that is in its non-negative form, like upright and in the mind, at first is received by the body on its way to the brain in inverse form. So that means we aren't seeing the world itself when we finally see it. We're seeing a reflection, an image of the world that starts off in our system, in our past the eyes and before it gets processed by the brain, in inverse form. The brain then processes all of that and understands that it has to flip things around, invert it, and then projects that inverted image onto the brain's consciousness, where it is received and awared. So it all happens very quickly. So when you see a tree, you're seeing an image of the tree that has been inverted, processed by the brain, flipped around, and then we experience the image of the world inside our consciousness. And it's an experience, but we know the experience. We have it every single second of every single day. And the experience is designed to create the impression that we're not seeing an image, but it feels like we're just seeing what is outside. What we're actually registering is something inside our brain. When you're looking at the chair, you're not looking at the chair really. There's an experience arising in our consciousness of a chair and the rest of the world that has been picked up by the senses. So that's what I mean by an experience. Each moment is an experience arising in consciousness. So I've spoken about the visual component of the experience just now. And we know that the experience that we have in each moment is a multi-sensory experience. That's recording. Yeah. A multi-sensory experience, meaning the visuals, so sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and then some other layers to the experience, what we could call internal feelings, so feelings of hunger, feelings of tiredness. There's a layer of experience which is, you could say, intuition, and also thoughts. Now, all of these components are projected onto the consciousness of the brain to create the one complete experience we have of the world and ourself. So maybe we can start to see that what we call the feelings inside of me versus those objects outside of me, in the final experience are all inside the person's consciousness. So nothing is really outside of our consciousness. The sensations of hunger, for example, that we would say, oh, that's a feeling inside of me, is arising inside of our consciousness. That's how it's awared. That's how it's known. So all of those bodily sensations are transmitted to the brain in the same way that the visual information is transmitted to the brain, and it's all collated and put into a very cohesive package that we know as the experience of daily life. And when that experience is felt, it feels like it's an experience created of a body in a world, and then we get to feel feelings that we can say are feelings inside my body, and see things that feel like they are outside of the body, which, if there is an objective world, is actually what's happening, because there is a objective person in the world, and the chair is outside of that person, and the tree is outside of that person, and the sensation of hunger is arising inside the body organism of the objectively real person. So the raw experience, not the raw experience, the raw movement is of sensations inside a body and objects outside the body. However, the experience, i.e. what we get to know, is very different, very different. It's a different thing to the raw movement that's happening in the objective world. We are getting the experience of all of that sent to the brain, and then the brain experiences exactly what we know as daily life. Pretty amazing. Really? And when the brain malfunctions, our experience malfunctions. If any of the senses, which are essentially the receptors of the external world, malfunction, then the experience is affected. So if someone loses their eyesight, then the experience can no longer include a visual component. It can't include a visual component that is inspired by the reflection of light from outside. People can still have an experience that would include visual, but that visual is now a visual created solely by the brain, based on its memory, you could say, of what visual is. So a blind person could still have a daydream, could imagine visuals, if their brain capacity, based on how long ago it was that they had been seeing and all sorts of strange things. In theory, their experience could still include some sort of visuals, but it wouldn't be a visual of light from outside creating the visual world. And similarly, if the ears stop functioning, then the experience can't include sound received from outside. So the experience is dependent both on the functioning of the brain and the functioning of the external senses. So your eyes could be very functional and your ears could be very functional, and if a neurosurgeon knows where to prod the brain or put electrical signals, they can alter your experience. So when you have hallucinogenic drugs, the hallucinogenic drug plays around with the brain chemistry, and what is normally the normal function of the brain is interrupted, and a new function of the brain takes place that creates a new experience of daily life, which we could argue whether it's an experience of daily life or whether it's a hybrid between the experience of daily life and the experience of an imagination or a daydream or a night dream. all of which is a creation, an experience arising in, well, I'll call it the brain, and the brain has a faculty of consciousness which essentially receives the experience and registers, knows the experience. And the essence of this consciousness is, the basic essence of the consciousness is awareness and the sense of being. So if there was no sense of being intrinsic in consciousness, there would be an image of the external world, and it would be registered in the brain, but there would be no sense of any I, and so I use the word I in an impersonal sense. There wouldn't be any sense of anything aware of it. There would be awareness, but if being wasn't an aspect of consciousness, there would just be awareness of it and no sense of anything there. Now, people that are familiar with beingness will know what I mean. And the beingness, the experience of beingness, pervades our experience all the time, which is why we automatically say, well, I am aware of the chair. Because that essence, that one of those intrinsic aspects of consciousness, being and awareness. If there was if consciousness didn't have awareness, then the light would come in from outside, the brain would process it, but there'd be nothing to receive it. So in a coma, the person is still alive, the eyes are still intact, and they will receive external stimuli, but the brain and the consciousness are not functioning, so the external stimuli will only get processed to a certain extent, and there's nothing there to receive the external stimuli. So it means if there's clapping, nothing hears the clapping. Well, nothing receives, nothing registers the sound. So from inside the person in a coma, or let's say under sedation in an operation, nothing is being received, no experience. So you can get cut in an operation. I'm guessing, because I'm not an expert in some of these things, the brain is still going to register pain. So there will be movement in various areas of the brain based on the cut and all of the nerves and what have you, and yet there's nothing to receive that pain because the consciousness is gone. And so I'm talking about the aspect of consciousness which is awareness, and there's two basic aspects of consciousness: awareness and beingness. So if there was no awareness, the image would come in, but it wouldn't be received by anything. It's received by the awareness aspect of consciousness. And the other aspect is the beingness aspect, the I am, the I thread. And that I thread is so familiar to us, except we might not realize what I'm speaking about, because it's so always there, and that is the sense I am, I exist. And we tend to have that feeling I am, not in its very impersonal, basic form, but rather that sense of I am, which is intrinsic to consciousness, wrapped around, covered up, or not covered up, but clothed in all of the personal experience. So the sense of the body wraps around the I, the thoughts that we have tend to wrap around the I, and therefore the experience is I. There is something at the center of the experience, in a sense. I receive, I see. So if there was just awareness and no I, it would be a very strange, almost inanimate, or not inanimate, there would be the registering, but I can't say nothing there to register, because it would be registered if awareness was there. It would be registered, but with this beautiful essence of I not there. And so some people might say mistakenly, oh, I know what pure awareness is without the I. And I would say, no, you don't. You might know it. You might know an experience of awareness without the I am this person. I am Roger, male, 45, and all the person. But the impersonal I is still there when we are having a very silent being, just being with what is. No labeling, no sense of the body, no sense of any personality, because there's no thinking happening. And someone might think, oh, that is awareness without an I. Not at all. It is not at all awareness without I. The I is, in its basic form, is impersonal, so it doesn't have a sense of gender, it doesn't have a sense of age, it doesn't have any personality, it doesn't have any characteristics to it. But it does have the intrinsic sense of isness, being I. We're so used to knowing I as me that whenever we talk about the sense of I am, we can automatically assume that means the sense of the person, the personal I. And so when that falls away in a particular moment, if we find ourselves just being with the experience, someone might, because the personal sense falls away, they might say, oh, the I fell away. And it didn't. The I is very much in that experience. If we pulled the I away, if we could pull the I away independent and leave awareness there, which you can't, the two always arise simultaneously, but if you could pull the I away and awareness, it would be a very different experience to what someone has when they are sitting, just being, where the sense of the body falls away.
That in this impersonal sense of I, there is still, or there, it could be argued that the body is actually still part of that experience. Because the body, in a way, is always there. So in its most impersonal form, it's just in the form of sensation.
Yeah. So what I'm pointing at, where I say the sense of the body falls away, is that in the experience itself, the
idea of a body is not. It's not there.
Yeah, not only the idea, but the visual part of the body is there. Any feedback from the body can fall away in an experience where there is just being, and the sense then is what I am is not located anywhere. And there will be, if one sits really still, and the body is outside of the experience, meaning you need to move your head in front of the body. So, and if you're really present with the experience, there is, contained in this experience, there is no body in your experience.
Yeah. Right? There is sensation though, but you couldn't label what that sensation is. There's like warmth and weight and...
Yes, so it doesn't create the impression of a body. The sensation that's there is bits and pieces that our thinking can, project onto those bits and pieces of sensation. That is my leg. That's it. So that doesn't mean the body isn't there anymore. It just means that within the experience doesn't contain a lot of feedback of the body, and so you could say the experience is of I am, but there being no body. And you can also have an experience like that where the body is there, so you can still see the visuals of the body, but the identification with the body, or you could say the sense of being located body-centric can fall away, and there is a sense that what I am is the awareness and the body is simply an object. So the quality of the experience changes. All these are a very varied experience. So we've seen what experience is, and daily life is a mix. The experience is always changing. And so when we have certain peak experiences, that is the experience being created a particular way. And so if we manipulate the brain through certain type of conditioning, the brain will eventually produce experience in line with that conditioning. So that means, simply, even the conditioning can be anything. It can be hitting someone with a stick repetitively will create the seeing of the stick at some point will create a component in the experience, so fear or whatever. So the experience is, in that case, different to when the person saw the stick before they had been abused by the stick consistently. And in the same way, if you instruct the brain to see life from a different perspective, and it keeps functioning with that new information, see life from outside, for example, rather than inside. You are not the body, you are formless awareness. The brain will start producing a different experience in line with the instruction. You are not the body, you are that which witnesses the body. Eventually the brain says, I better create an experience that is in line with reality rather than in line with an illusory way of seeing life. Because it was told that knowing yourself as the body is illusory. And the truth or reality is you are not the body. And so when that shift happens, we can be prone to thinking that now reality is known. And we can say, they were right. There was reality, and I only knew ignorance or illusion. To us as reality, the old way has fallen away or has changed. So then we say, experience, because we've also been told that the word experience applies to subject-object relationship. So sometimes in some teachings, the word experience is specifically used to denote an experience that includes a subject that is seeing an object outside of itself, which is the normal, standard way that the human evolution develops our experience of the world. And that standard way is very prone to developing attachment to outcome as part of the brain setup. And because attachment to outcome is referred to as not knowing oneself, because it says what I am is something that needs pleasure, 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 and it's part and parcel of experiencing the world as a body and an external world, and that external world delivers pleasure and pain to the body, and what we come to know as the best we can get in life from a young age is, more pleasure and less pain. So our sense of self gets developed in line with, I need more pleasure and less pain. And so the spiritual teachings will say, well, that's ignorance. That's not knowing yourself. But actually it's a development of the human being based on the way this world is, and that development can be reversed or changed such that we come to know ourselves differently. So the experience is created where a new aspect is included in the experience that wasn't included originally, which is referred to as the core of our being, or the essence of I am. That has always been there, but there's been no attention on it. No attention means it doesn't feature in the experience that the brain creates. It's in the background, essentially, covered up by the objects that are believed to be outside of ourselves, the objects that will deliver pleasure or potentially deliver pain. And so we are focused, we're invested in everything outside of ourselves, because we've come to see that from experience that the best we can get in life is more pleasure and less pain. So hence, as is described in Buddhism in particular, we have aversion of pain and desire for pleasure, which essentially equates to attachment to outcomes. Then the spiritual teachings start asking us to turn our attention. So when they ask us, they're essentially, it's new conditioning delivered to the brain, and the brain, being intelligent, having an intellect, can process that information. And as it processes the information, it can follow instruction. Just like as a child, we're told to look left and right when you cross the road. That is new conditioning that comes in, and the brain processes that, receives it, and then we start functioning that way. When a spiritual teaching starts telling you, you've forgotten yourself, don't you want to know the truth? What you know is ignorance, not the truth. What you know is yourself as the body, which is an error. So the teachings are delivering new conditioning to the brain, and that new conditioning can start getting the brain to function differently.
Roger, may I ask you on a practical example? For example, when I sit here, I feel pain in the back, and you said that it's some kind of trick or illusion, because I identify myself. When I say to myself, okay, if I feel pain, obviously it's my pain, obviously it's me. But as you already said, it's not true, right? I feel pain in the body, but there is. I feel that I'm in some way sticked with the body, but obviously because it's tricking me, I feel pain of the body, and I say to myself, okay, it's my pain, my back hurt me, but obviously there is a body that feels pain, and there is something else that identify with that, or
Yeah, so let's go back to the experience is created, and in the same way as you have the experience of other people and trees and chairs, they are components of the experience based on the physical sense of sight that the body has. So it picks up that and sends that signal to the brain, and so it includes that as part of the experience. If someone gets a pin and sticks it in the body, in the same, because the body has a sense of touch, nerves and all of that, registers pain and sends that signal to the brain. So the pain becomes part of the experience. The pain is real, in a sense. Just when I say real, it is a real component of the experience. Just like seeing the chairs and the people are a real component of the experience. So the brain isn't tricking us, the brain is recreating the experience that the body is having.
What do you mean recreating? It makes some interpretation of what's happening, or
it interprets the external world according to the instrument that the body is. So the eyes are like cameras, the ears are like microphones, and so it picks up what is outside. So we are essentially a sensory instrument. So we pick up what's outside, that information goes to the brain, and the brain creates the experience of it. Which we know as daily life. So your experience that you're having now is an experience arising in your brain, in your consciousness. So when you feel pain in your back, it's because the nerves, for example, or the muscles are tight or pinched. And so the nerves send that information to the brain, and it's registered as a sensation, which is part of the overall sensory experience that we call daily living. Then your attitude to the pain, right?
Whose attitude?
Well, the attitude that the brain creates as part of the experience. See, really, there is no one other than when you look at it, if you say this experience is a whole lot of layers of different layers of experience, and when they're all layered together, it creates this impression that we have, the impression of being a person in a world. Right? If you deconstruct the experience like we're doing now, and you see it as a whole lot of layers, then you say, well, who am I? There is the sense, the experience of a body thrown into conscious, like projected onto consciousness, and then there are thoughts layered on in a particular place in the experience that makes it then feel like the body is thinking, right? Which it is. The body is thinking, but from the experience point of view, it's a whole lot of layers of experience. The body then gets hit and there is pain, so now there is in the experience, there is the sense that the body has been hit. So especially when you look at the thinking component, and the thought has a story in it. And the story says, I am thinking. I am very successful, or I am better than the other. And this is why this investigation is very important, because at some point you'll see that the sense of I, sorry, not the sense of I that we were talking about before is not the thought. Right? The sense of I is a primal feeling in the experience. But the belief, I am more successful, or I am better than the other, or I am a failure. That is a thought.
Not just belief, but if I say my back hurts, it's also thought.
Yes?
That is a result of information that body sends to brain, and brain produces thought, and that's understandable. But I don't. I stop there. I don't see connection. You said, and it's connected to consciousness, but yeah, it's first part of the story is clear to me, but I I have a gap.
So, pain in the body is sent to the experience center as pain. So that pain gets drawn into the experience. And obviously it's not just the pain that gets drawn in, the sense of the body with its edges is also in the picture, and so then the pain is drawn into a particular part of the experience that has been defined as the body. Then the pain is added in. When the pain stops, it essentially means the experience is there and the pain is pulled out of the experience. So then you don't experience pain. It's stopped. So the pain is there, and it means it gets added into the experience. Once it's added into the experience works in such a way that if there is pain, it is registered, and then the brain can comment on it. The brain comments on it, and that commentary is essentially a thought. Like, oh, that pain is something I haven't felt before. Right? Or that pain must be a result of the 16-kilometer run that I did yesterday. Now, that is thinking, and it's not necessary, it's not inaccurate, but it's another layer of the experience. Right? So the experience includes senses, taste, touch, smell, sight and sound, feelings in the body, including pain, thoughts, emotions, intuition. All of these are different faculties of the body, and because the body has these faculties, it will project those faculties onto the experience center, and they will become part of the experience that we have. And so in this teaching, we break it down into the working mind and the thinking mind. The thought, well, this is a pain I haven't experienced before, that could be the working mind. Right? It's not suffering. The thinking mind is suffering. The pain itself is not suffering. The pain is just pain. So the thought, oh, I haven't experienced that pain before, working mind. Then another thought, that pain must be because of the 16-kilometer run I did yesterday, working mind again. Right? Then, and that's part of the experience, because you are aware of the pain and you're also aware of the thinking. It's part of the experience. So then you might say to your friend, you know, I've got a really sharp pain in my back. I haven't felt it before, and I think it's because of running. What do you think? So all of this is the experience being created by the brain because of the functioning of the body in the world. So essentially the body functions in the world, and that then is translated into an experience of the body functioning in the world. Your friend says something and you hear it, and that sound is part of the experience, and the brain knows how to interpret those sounds, and then it creates an answer. And so sound is then, your answer is included in the next part of the experience. So the experience is continually unfolding. I'm not talking about something abstract, I'm talking about what we all know as daily living, moment after moment after moment. So the pain is real. It's real pain in the body, and it's being translated into the experience. Now, the experience can be very varied. You can have pain that doesn't even exist in the physical body, and it's psychosomatic pain. But that's just another faculty of the brain, and so it can add in that component into the experience. There's thinking, part of the experience, and then there's suffering, which is more thinking, but of a specific thought. There's even, there's the category of memory as well, which is a form of thought, but specific thought about something that happened in the past. And that component of memory is part of the experience, and it creates a sense of time, a sense of 10 years ago, because of a thought, which we call memory, that remembers, oh, I remember being on holiday at the beach 10 years ago, it was so nice. And now in the experience, there is a sense of perspective, simply because of a very special object that creates perspective. And our memory is very unique. We might only know memory as something that tells us about something from 10 years ago. Our memory actually works on many different levels, and we have memory about something that happened 2 milliseconds ago. And if that stops working, we wouldn't be able to have a conversation, and a lot of our functioning in life would not work. But that memory is so subtle in a sense. We only realize it if it stops working. And so our experience is completely created by a whole lot of different objects, you could say, that are projected onto the present moment. And if one of those objects falls away, then the experience changes. And some of the objects are very important at creating a certain sense in the experience. Memory is one of them that creates a sense of time. When we look into the future and imagine things in the future, have expectations, it creates a sense of time in another direction. Right? So when we come into the present moment, or what is called coming into the present moment, it's effectively the brain switching into a different mode of operation where certain faculties of the brain get shut down. Because we've been trained to say, let me be with what is. So no need to think about the past or the future. And the experience now is an experience, but with the absence of certain objects. So it feels different. No object of thinking about something that happened yesterday, no projecting into the future. And so the experience is now going to feel exactly as it feels based on all of the objects that exist, and is not going to feel like it would feel if certain other objects were present that aren't present now. So our suffering is an object in the experience, because the brain has been developed in such a way that it has to habitually create this object because that's the way it sees life. The brain says the person is the doer, and the brain doesn't even know that the brain is creating the world. So once the brain becomes conditioned to understand how the experience is created, the brain stops producing the thought that I am a separate independent entity with complete volition, and it says I'm a machine. I'm a machine producing an experience exactly according to the way I'm designed. That's a new component in the experience. Right? The previous component in the experience was a thought that says, and I'm talking about something deeply ingrained, so it's not actually a thought, but it's when it is a thought in such a deeply ingrained way, and so those thoughts have a special power, like everything else that arises in the moment, has a special power of creating a certain sense in the experience. So the deeply ingrained belief that I am the doer, which really means I don't see myself as a machine, because the brain hasn't actually interpreted life. It's been alive and interpreting for a long time. It's interpreted a lot of things. It hasn't investigated certain inner functionings. And so it hasn't concluded that, wow, what I am is a machine. And so when it hasn't concluded that, what it's been developed to function as is I am a doer. And I can do whatever I choose of my own free will. That is what the machine is saying. That's what the machine is contributing to the experience. So then the experience has that sense. Yeah?
Actually, through the teaching, you try to become, to reprogram, to do reprogramming, or to put out, let's say, one kind of software in us and replace it with another one.
Mm-hmm. That's what the teaching is. I've been trying to tell everyone that we are biological instruments functioning according to our design, so that the biological instrument registers that it is a biological instrument, and it stops inserting into the experience a different belief. Right? If it keeps inserting into the experience, I am the doer, every time something goes wrong in the experience, every time there is pain, it then has to produce the thought, I'm such a failure. And every time something goes right in the experience, it says, I'm such a genius. Shame and pride. If it gets reprogrammed to know itself more accurately, it says, I'm a machine doing what life, God, the programmer, has programmed me to do. So don't beat me up. I'm not going to beat myself up. And then when someone else beats us up, the machine says, I know, you're beating me up because you don't realize I'm a machine. That's understandable. I didn't realize I was a machine either.
You mean that we completely depends, like a computer, on the input we receive, and our output is based on the input we receive and kind of software we have. If we have bad software, we behave like we behave normally. Mm-hmm. And if we have reprogrammed software, or software that is, let's say, enlightened one, output is okay.
That's right. So life is always delivering new conditioning, and that new conditioning may radically change our up-to-date conditioning. How the new conditioning changes our up-to-date conditioning is not in our control, because we're a machine and we get programmed, and we don't control how the programming reconfigures us. So, if I'm a machine talking, delivering new programming, the machine over there is receiving it, but whether the changes inside happen the way we would like them to happen, or whether it comes up with a new story and then in a week's time tells me, hey, you told me this, and I said, what? I told you what? No, I didn't tell you that, I told you this. And you say, oh, really? I thought you were saying this. Or in a week's time you tell me, you know what, you told me this, and now I see it. And so I'm saying the same thing. How the new conditioning affects the up-to-date conditioning is not in my control, and it's not in your control. But it will have an effect, or it'll have no effect, or something or nothing will happen. But like the waves going over rocks, there is a change. So new conditioning will have some effect, but we don't know if it's going to be good or bad. And Melton as well.
I've been asking myself why God makes it so difficult for us to become enlightened. I understand that it wouldn't be a lot of fun for God to have everyone know that we're one, because then the game would be over, kind of. But why aren't we born and stay that way that you are, for example? If everybody didn't suffer anymore and had the experience of I am a person, then God would still have the experience of life being lived, and we still don't know what's happening, but we wouldn't suffer. Why did God include this whole amount of suffering?
Yeah, that's in another of the manifestations. That one, the one you mentioned, is in another of the universes.
Is that something you know with capital letters, or something you believe?
I'm basically saying this manifestation has been created so that the story that we know is the story that unfolds, right? We're talking hypothetically in a way about God, because there isn't this God out there enjoying this. If anything, so it really depends what we mean by God. If anything, to me, I would say God has turned into. So God is really source, and we don't know what source is. Source could be any number of things. But source has become the manifestation, has turned into you and I. So there isn't a God laughing or feeling sad about what you or I are experiencing. What you or I are experiencing is God experiencing it, because God has become all of this. And this particular creation was a creation, it seems, of, well, we could say forgetting ourselves, or knowing ourselves only partially, being developed in a way that we become heavily outwardly focused, suffer as a result, and then at some point the story of life starts to change that. And evolution, which is what this story is about, it's a story of evolution and complexity, is, in my mind, taking us towards peace of mind, taking us towards what you spoke about, where people are born and they don't turn out the way we turned out. They are born into a different environment that supports a clear understanding of oneself. But that requires people to first have evolved to a point where they are clear, to then be able to support and bring new humans into a world, and those humans are then going to develop with a very different set of conditioning than we have. So this particular manifestation is a story of evolution, a story of developing in a way where we are outwardly focused and we suffer. And as a result of evolution, some human beings have gone a little further in a way, or they, not really further, but they are the pioneers of the species moving to the next stage of evolution. Just like, a monkey that was living in an environment that really needed it to be able to get ants or something out of a very narrow hole, and over time the finger of that particular monkey started to develop, and some monkeys, the pioneers, which it's totally impersonal, right? The finger growing long and pointy is not something they achieve. It's simply something that happens as a result of intelligence. biological intelligence, and some will be at the head of at the crest of the wave of that evolutionary change. And then all of the others follow. So we've got examples of enlightened beings from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and so it goes on. And the more that happens, the more new conditioning that brings about this change happens, and then the more people that change in a way that brings about less suffering and more peace. And at some point, the balance of power shifts, and there's much more of this information, much more of this way of being in life, and the change can happen rapidly. But this is a story of evolution, so it's going to happen the way it happens. In what I said is what you said, where none of the suffering ever happens, and a world is created where people love each other and are at peace. That's another manifestation that God created. Maybe. Not this one. Well, you don't know about the other manifestation that God created. It could be much worse, couldn't it?
Thank you for answering. There is one more aspect I would like to have discussed. It must be my personal mind making this up, and still it doesn't feel very satisfactory because of that. There is this feeling of if Source turned into this creation, why? I mean, why this particular creation?
Why not?
Because it seems that Source is impersonal, is not touched by anything that we experience, not by our suffering, by our stories. It's a good question, why not? And I have this feeling of there is something missing for me to be at peace about it. It seems, if I put it bluntly, it seems unfair. Mm-hmm. It seems like, okay, you're not touched by the shit I'm going through. The evolution will be that I'm not feeling this anymore and realize that I'm you. Is my feeling of being angry at Source just the personal story I have?
No, it's part of the creation.
Yeah, but you know what I'm getting at? It's like I can see from a bird's eye view, I can see all of what you're saying, and I can feel at peace about it once I ascend to the heights of a bird. But when I'm in my everyday life, I sometimes have this feeling of it's unfair. It's like you have all the fun. You have kind of all the fun, and I'm not. And
who, you, as in me, or God?
No, Source. You have like. Yes, it's not so easy for me to carry on because there's always a point where I can feel that it's doesn't make much sense to think about it, but there is this lingering feeling of okay, on the one hand, Source isn't touched by anything, and at the same time, I am Source, so Source experiences what I'm experiencing, but knows at the same time that it's not harmful, if that is correct.
No, it's not.
Okay, but if Source doesn't realize that it's harmful, then why would source makes something that's evolutionary and in the end hopefully turns out to be loving kindness for everybody, why is the first step that we are having, going through all the pain, through all the suffering, and then realizing what you've just said, why isn't that jumped? I mean, you say, why not, of course, but can you...
Well, okay, because there's a lot of things here to throw into this conversation. One, because the uncomfortableness, the angriness, the blaming source, actually, when you look at it, is a form of suffering. So you have to see that first, because when that when that's released, you won't have the same perspective that you're putting forward, right? But that's not to say that you shouldn't have that, because it's there for very specific reasons. So it has to be there. It's part of the evolution, actually. So one thing is that this source, you've created an idea of source that doesn't really exist. Almost like, so source, now you're saying it's God, right? So to me, source is just a word, meaning there must be something, we can say theoretically, there must be something that all this came from, right? But we don't know what that is. So in what you're putting forward, you've sort of solidified what source is a little bit more than what I'm saying source is, and saying, oh, source is out there, in a way, separate from this, having fun, or source is, if it's not out there separate, it's part of this, but it's having an experience separate to my experience, and it's not touched by the experience, but I am. So I don't like that. It's sort of like source having a fun experience or a interesting experience because it's not touched, but I am. So I don't really want to be the guinea pig. The one. Okay. So there isn't a source having an experience outside of the experience you're having. When I say source has become the manifestation, and even this is a concept, it's not necessarily what has actually happened, because we can't really know what has happened. But this is a useful story, and so that means when I say it's a useful story, it doesn't mean, oh, it's a story, it's not the truth, so it's pointless. Stories are very, very useful at getting us to see things. And then once we see it, and we realize, oh, that story helped me, that metaphor helped me, we can let go of the metaphor and just run with what we have seen, right? So let's say source has become you and me. So it no longer exists as source, it only exists as you and me. It only exists as the victim and the perpetrator. So it is having the experience of being the victim and the experience of being the perpetrator. So the victim, when the victim feels separate and only knows itself as the one that can be hurt by the perpetrator's actions, that is the separation. That is where God has completely lost itself, or source has completely lost itself in that storyline, right? Which it in itself created. So source isn't inflicting pain on something other than itself. So what about horror movies? There are comedies, there are dramas, there are action films, and then there are horror movies. And if we look at movie making as a art, these can be masterpieces. Each is a masterpiece in a particular genre. Now, the horror movie is a valid masterpiece in that genre, and if we took all horror movies out, then infinite creativity isn't able to express itself. So that's why horror movies have turned up as a genre, because the creativity says, wow, I can create a horror movie as an experience. Maybe that's why Source has created this experience the way it is, because it's a valid masterpiece. Source is, in its resting state, infinite creative potentiality. I mean, infinite creative potentiality. So, in theory, you would say it's going to manifest in infinite ways to express its infinite creativity. And that, we could say, in theory, there are all sorts of different manifestations, universes. Ones that are completely in line with what you said would be ideal, ones that are like this, and others that are completely different. There would, in theory, we could say there would be universes that aren't based on duality, aren't based on time and space, don't have humans. They might just be universes of color, or who knows, we can't even conceive what infinite creative potentiality could produce. We only can conceive sort of within the boundaries of this manifestation that we know, and to some extent our creativity can imagine beyond the boundaries, but nowhere near to the infinite creative potential. So maybe that explains why this is feasible. Why this? Well, why not means, yes, it's a valid creation, valid masterpiece. Then you can look at your anger, which is really God lost, as in God creating an impression of me and God, and that God just simply doesn't exist, the one that's been created. So then you can say, oh, and my non-reconciliation with this, my non-acceptance of this, is simply a result of the interpretation of life and what it means to me. And so then that non-acceptance, that resistance, becomes understandable, rather than saying it needs to be reconciled, rather than feeling that the universe needs to change so that the resistance is not there. We can say, oh no, the universe is valid, and we understand why the resistance to the universe, which is valid, is there, because of the experience that is created when God has included this belief in doership and attachment to outcome, which in effect creates a disconnect from the part of us that is available. Not necessarily available at any time. It's available when the brain changes, and then the experience includes this aspect in it that hasn't been included before. So at a time when your experience, which you've experienced on and off, at a time when the sense of I is particularly present and you can just rest and be, you might laugh at the fact that you found the universe so unacceptable. Your experience in that moment would be, who cares? Who cares that it's like this? There isn't someone saying it shouldn't be like this when we're resting and being. And that's how, that's in a way, that's what it means when we hear, suffering is an illusion, it's not real. It's an interpretation of something. And when that interpretation, and within the interpretation there is the me that needs life to be a certain way in order to be the me that feels like it needs life in order to be a certain way to be complete. And so when life isn't that way, within that me there is an uncomfortableness, a sense like this isn't right. I can't rest with this. I just don't see why God would create this. So that's contained in the me. And in an instant, if dropping into being is something that life has started to make more available, which really means the brain creates the thought, your happiness, let's say, a thought that says I am, or your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, which then allows for the experience to change, and we just drop into being, and that me dissolves. And from one instant to the next, we have a shift where this is unacceptable to who cares? Like really that becomes, your sense is like, oh, I am, and I don't see a problem with the universe anymore when I am. Then when we go from I am back into the me, and that becomes the experience, then it's suddenly, what was I thinking? There's no problem with the universe. This just isn't right. These are the two different, there's the self-image, and then there's the self. And if we rest in self, Ramana summed it up nicely as self. We sort of say, well, we can see the manifestation as being, really our experience of the manifestation is our experience that we dissolve each night in deep sleep. And so if the body is dying, and it doesn't have to be as dramatic as we imagine. Let's say you're just lying in bed and the life force drains out of you. The experience of life just gone. There's no one to have a problem. Death is the end of life. Death is the end of experience. And when you look at that, you can have an experience that had all sorts of turmoil in it, all sorts of suffering. Before that experience came into being, there was nothing. Then the experience came into being, all sorts of turmoil, then the person dies and goes back to nothing. So you can, in the end, you can look at it and go, the experience, who did it really happen to? At first there was nothing, then there was the experience, and then there was nothing again. And when there's nothing, there's no one there to be concerned about the fact that there's nothing. There's no one there saying, oh, I'm really annoyed that the experience has ended, because the one who would be saying that is in the experience. So the experience comes to an end, and there's nothing. That's why actually death is the great relief. It's in Sanskrit, we have samadhi, which is when you go into a state of liberation, let's say, or peace. And death is mahasamadhi, the ultimate peace. And so Ramana summed it up as in, really, when you look at it from this point of view, you even say there is no creation, there is no dissolution. So what I'm saying is there was nothing, then there's the creation, and in this case I'm talking about the personal creation of a person's lifespan, their experience, and then it dissolves back to nothing. You start with nothing, you end up with nothing. Ramana said, I'd prefer to say there's no creation, there's no dissolution, nothing ever happened. So that's why they say suffering is illusory, because it's there, but at any point it can come to an end, not necessarily with just with physical death, but also with this shift into being that's happening for us.
So was it Ramana that said, like, to die before you die? For somebody, what does that mean to you?
Well, I don't know if it was Ramana, but it really means to die to each moment, to come to a position where you are dying to each moment, which really means that once a particular moment is gone, you aren't holding on to it anymore. So you die with the moment, in a sense, and you're recreated with the next moment, which when we deconstruct the experience the way we were doing, and we see that experience is really recreated fresh by the brain each moment, and the sense of I and all of the thoughts and the emotions and the body and everything is new in that moment. And if the brain stops functioning where it keeps dragging what happened in the past into the present moment and regretting it and worrying about the future, if the brain stops doing that, then we can say that the faculty that keeps us alive, keeps the past alive, has died. And so that's the change that is referred to dying before you die. And what dies essentially is the belief in personal doership, the belief in attachment to outcome, the belief that I am the one that made life happen, makes the experience happen. And as a result of the death or dissolution of that particular functioning of the person, there is more contact with that part of us that doesn't actually require the future to have been, the past to have been different, doesn't have an expectation on the future because it knows that what happens in the future is just experience, and that I am always going to be at the core of experience in such a way that if the understanding has happened, which equates to the death of the misunderstanding, then there's no expectation, because it's like, well, there is going to be experience. My whole life has been experience, and it's now such that there is experience with the sense of being available, and life is then experienced from that point of view, where it's known that actually I'm complete regardless of circumstance.
The part about being a machine doesn't sit right with me. Like, I don't experience peace of mind in this moment around that. Is there another term you could use?
Yeah, well, the problem is if I say we're a robot, does that help? No. And the answer is no. Obviously no, because what happens when we hear the word machine or robot, you visualize the robot on Will Robinson. Yeah, but so that's what it's. We say biological robot, but still, what comes into your mind is, the box from the 1970s, that sort of robot, and a machine. You're thinking of some oil rig thing going up and down, a washing machine. Biological robot, biological machine. You're a doctor, you would know, is referring to, the veins and the skin organ. All of that equates to the stuff of the washing machine has an outer skin. We have an outer skin. The washing machine has pipes. We have pipes. The washing machine has a motor and a pump. We have a pump. And it has a filter, and we have filters. And some washing machines have central processing units, and we have a central processing unit. And so calling us a machine doesn't reduce us down from what this machine is. it is a machine, and this machine has the capacity to experience love and emotions and intellect. And so the problem with the word machine is when we reduce how we know ourselves down to some imaginary sense that we imagine would be the experience of a machine. Whereas what I'm saying is the experience that we have, moment after moment after moment, is the experience of a machine. So now just calling ourselves a machine doesn't change the depth of experience, the profundity of life.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the part of it for me that I'm still hung up on is like my conditioning can get updated and like, but I want to know what's real. And is that just not possible? Like some non-dual teachers, they say who you are is unknowable, or the source, as you said, is unknowable. In a sense, like that there's a resonance with that, but then something is still just like, there's got to be something to hold on to, like something real, something trustworthy that has nothing to do with my brain projecting or...
Right, so it depends what we define as real or truth. If you want to, so often the word absolute is interchangeable with truth. If someone is saying, I want to know the absolute, I want to know truth, like that which doesn't change, it's not available to know. Why it's useful in teachings is because truth seems like a very noble quest. So if we get presented that we don't know the truth and the truth is available, that becomes part of the move, or the move towards truth is inspired by us calling it truth, but it's not necessarily a move towards truth, because I'm saying truth isn't available. However, I know from experience, and I'm sure many people know, that at some point in the process there is this sense, I just want that which is real. And it doesn't feel like it's a mind-created attachment or objective. It sort of feels much more like a driving desire for truth. And I would explain that as being, well, I don't think truth is available, for the simple fact that truth means not relative. Truth means absolute. And when we come to understand life as experience, and that you aren't ever going to shift out of experience into some reality, then you'd say, well, all I'm ever going to be able to know is experience in life. And experience is relative. And so then you go, well, that means no truth. So that's a technicality in a way. When I say there isn't any truth, it doesn't mean that it's not worth seeking truth, although it's not actually an ultimate truth you're seeking. It can be relative truths, something that is more real than something else. And one of the reasons that truth is very appealing to us is because we know intuitively that we're pretty inauthentic in our functioning. So the discussion we were having before, where we do what someone else wants us to do instead of doing what we feel like doing. And we put up masks and images of ourselves so that the world can see us a certain way, when inside we feel very different. And we think that is beneficial. We do it because on one level we think it's beneficial, and on another level we know it's a complete fraud. And it's not authentic. And so this searching for truth could be, I'm sick of lying to myself. I just want to be authentic. And there's another aspect to it, is that when we know ourselves only on the physical or material plane, that material plane changes and is much less consistent than another part of ourself that we can know ourselves as. So the sense of being and awareness is you could say ever present. It's always part of the experience, because experience is dependent on awareness and being. You can't have experience if you extract awareness and being out of it. And that's why resting in being is so self-confirming and self-contenting, because each time we drop back there, we find, oh, here I am. Here I am like I was yesterday and the day before and 10 years ago. And it's always the same sense of, I'm okay. It's always the same relief from suffering when we drop back into being, the suffering that comes when we don't remember that part of ourselves and are identified as something else, the suffering falls away. And so we could say that that part of myself is much more true than the thinking mind that is continually, is not acting consistently. It's always seeing the situation and saying, what do I do now to get the best out of this situation, to present myself in the best way? And there's nothing consistent about it. So consistency is something we're craving. And if we can find a consistency that is consistent and delivers peace of mind, then that's a great find, and it happens to be ourself.
I'm afraid that how I experience that, like the I am as you described, like maybe that's also a delusion. Like I feel like everything I've believed in my life to this point is a delusion, and I don't want more. But it's like being stuck. It's like those finger traps, those Chinese finger traps that you try and pull out. Then that's how I feel right now. It's like trying not to believe anything. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? It's like
it seems like it's a catch-22, and yet the process looks after the catch-22 scenario, because if it really was a catch-22, there'd be no liberation for anyone, because it's a catch-22. And yet the process somehow undermines the catch-22. And so following enacting or changing one's behavior so that you can just be more authentic in the areas that you recognize you're not being authentic. So simply something as simple as lying when you're late and you say, oh, the traffic was so terrible, and can you believe it that someone had an accident and they drove off the bridge and the bridge was closed for 20 minutes when in fact you left home 20 minutes late. We're afraid to be authentic, so we come up with a story. And if you realize that, you say, I'm not going to come up with stories anymore. Something as simple as that. So when you turn up late, you say, I'm sorry I left home 20 minutes late. Instead of some elaborate story.
Even sages may romance life.
Well, it's that, yes, it doesn't, when that we break the habit of being inauthentic, we can then find ourselves in a circumstance where we still the body is always going to move towards pleasure rather than pain. And we may decide that not telling the truth is a better option than telling the truth. As long as the habit of not telling the truth has been broken, it's different to not tell the truth when you know you're not telling the truth and when you have assessed it differently to just being afraid. And so to an extent, someone would say, well, you're afraid of the outcome, aren't you? If you decide that not telling the truth is, in this situation, better because of the consequences. And you'd say, well, it's not exactly that I'm afraid, it's that my biological preference would like this. So I'm going to do what I can, and then if I don't get what I can, I understand that that was destiny, and I'm not going to feel attacked on a level of self. But if I cannot feel attacked on the level of self and get pleasure instead of pain, then okay, once again, this is not an easy thing to explain, but it's very much about undoing the habit. And once the habit has been undone, you can then do something that you did when the habit was in place, and it's different. It still doesn't mean that lying is necessarily going to be give you great outcomes. My own experience, anyone's own experience might one day be after lying, even after the habit has been broken, and you realize actually it makes life complicated, and I'm not going to do it. But in a particular circumstance, the consequence might be very specific, the circumstance may be very specific, and you say, in this case, I'm going to take the risk. Although in principle, generally, I decide lying is not worth it. But on a particular occasion, you might say, I'm breaking my rule. So, picking something where you can see you're not authentic and making those changes is the best we can do, is actually, instead of being overwhelmed and saying, oh, it's too big a task.
Okay, so if I'm honest, so I'm 39 now, and when I was 26, I was suicidally depressed, and I wanted to kill myself so badly. And now, all these years later, all these awakenings, all these insights, like, sometimes there's a mild energy that might still come up, and I sit in it, and then it gets transmuted. And then I notice, like, in the work I'm doing now with people, at least, I don't know, like 3 to 5 people a week come in with suicidal thoughts, with suicidal, and I wonder if, it's a long way. I just was going to ask you what your take is on that, or anything you see with that in particular, like when people have that suicidal feeling or actually do it, and the rates are going up where I live, and I don't know, that was just coming up.
It's understandable to me, given how life can be experienced by some people, i.e. their particular makeup means the doership and the attachment to outcome based on some very extreme events that have happened in people's past and in history, in life, and how that makes people experience life on an ongoing basis, means to me that that phenomena of someone actually trying to kill themselves makes sense to me. It doesn't mean that it's good, especially for the people that love them. I don't have a solution for it, because I don't, there's very specific counseling and what have you that understands that better than I would. In fact, when someone has a certain makeup, putting forward teachings of non-duality are not necessarily appropriate, depending on a case-by-case situation. So I think the most useful thing I can say is it's understandable based on being able to appreciate how uncomfortable intense suffering feels, and if it is consistently the way someone experiences life, then to me it's just a simple calculation that someone has made, and it's testament of the uncomfortableness that they experience.
Same with addiction then, I guess, right? Like people that I see that are on heroin or whatever, that's the same.
Yeah, it's a consequence or an attempt to alleviate the suffering. So we actually didn't finish the dream exploration at all. We hardly started it. Although when I say we hardly started it, we did dive into an exploration of what the waking state experience is. So the waking state experience is an experience of life, and we're assuming that there is an objective world that is being recreated, or an image of that external world is being recreated by the brain so that we experience it as we do. So next time we'll talk about when the person lies in bed, falls asleep, and then the image of the external world, which is an image arising in the person's consciousness, is, well, it collapses, so there's no more experience of the external world, and then the subconscious kicks in and creates a new experience. Still an experience in the same consciousness that contained the experience of the waking state of daily living. The same consciousness being the consciousness of the person that was awake, who is now asleep, and instead of the image of the world being created from the external stimuli coming into the body and from the stimuli that are created within the body, all being sent to the brain and creating a very complex experience, a new experience is created from what we could say the subconscious, let's say. And that experience arises in the same consciousness, and if it's an experience of content, of time and space and physical landscape, and it includes a main character, a body with consciousness linked, the consciousness in which the whole experience arises is linked to that avatar, you could say, the main character. And then the experience that the subconscious creates is experienced from the perspective of that main character, because that's how the experience is created. So the experience is created to have a main character in it that experiences itself as a character in a world, and therefore it experiences the table and the chairs and the trees and the people as external to itself, when in fact the whole world is an image arising in that consciousness. So once we get to explore the dream and how a mind, which is consciousness, can create essentially a virtual world out of its imagination. So that's what a dream is really. It's the mind imagining a world and a person into existence in an instant. And the person then moves, walks, runs, swims in this virtual world, and it experiences pain and fear in this virtual world, and all of that is a creation, essentially, a masterpiece, an imagination of mind, in mind, made of mind. A masterpiece, a creation in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness.
It feels so real, right? Like this.
Yes, we have the first-hand experience of knowing how real a dream can feel. And if we start experiencing virtual realities, nowadays, from what I understand, the technology is developing where you can put a helmet on or whatever, and a world is presented, and the consciousness of the human being very quickly identifies and starts to see that image that is created as real. And so we can start having first-hand experience of how easy it is for an image within consciousness to be experienced from that perspective, very quickly. We can go from knowing life from one perspective, and once the environment is controlled in a certain way, we will very quickly identify with the new environment. And there's lots of really interesting experiments that can be done where I think they put your hand behind a cover and your other hand on the table, and then they put a rubber hand where your second hand would be, and they get a brush, and someone brushes the fake hand that you can see, and at the same time they brush your real hand that is behind a cover, and they ask you to look at your hand and the fake hand, and the brush is moving in the same strokes as the brush that is brushing your real hand. And after a while, our consciousness receives the input of the brush on our real hand and is looking at and sees the brushing of the fake hand. And very quickly we start to identify with the fake hand. And then they bring out a big hammer and smash the fake hand.
Is that how it ends, the experiment?
It ends with a very startled subject. And it demonstrates how very quickly our consciousness will identify with an object.